Syria's civil war and the over 50-year rule of the Assad family came to a stunning end on December 8, 2024, when rebel fighters led by the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham succeeded in toppling the brutal dictatorship of Bashar Assad. It's hard to overstate the devastation wrought by the conflict, which started with a peaceful uprising against the Assad regime 14 years ago. And that uprising followed decades of predation by the Assad family and its supporters. The war saw more than 500,000 people killed and nearly 14 million Syrians, more than half the pre-war population, displaced internally and abroad. So what will governance now look like in Syria under the transitional government of Ahmad al-Sharaa? And what's next for the Syrian people, including the more than 6 million refugees living abroad? The country remains in a state of deep impoverishment, fragmentation, and uncertainty. But already, some governments are calling for the repatriation of Syrians within their country's borders, even as the humanitarian crisis in Syria continues. Today's guests are Rana Khoury, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who has studied the relationship between international aid, civil society, and diaspora during the Syrian civil war, and Ibrahim Al-Assil, a political scientist and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, whose work focuses on geopolitics, state evolution, and regional security. We'll explore the future of governance in Syria and prospects for refugee return. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Let's talk about what happened on December 8 in Syria. The flight of Assad to Moscow, the collapse, finally, of this regime, and the political situation in the country now. Now, Ibrahim, I'll start with you.
Great to be with you, David. Thanks so much for having us. On December 8th, history happened. It's really difficult to put it in a few words and describe what Syrians and Syria went through on that day, but it's probably one of the most important days that the Syrian nation has lived over the last 100 years. We're talking about a collapse not only of a dictator that led the war against his own people for 13 to 14 years, but a dynasty that ruled Syria for most of the decades after independence. And it also marked an end of an era for Syria and the region. When we talk about pan-Arabism, when we talk about socialism, when we talk about type of governments that prevailed in the region post the wave of independence after World War II in the region, and then Saddam Hussein fell in 2003, Gaddafi, and today Syria. And this really marks a beginning of totally new chapter for Syria, Syrians, and the region. This moment, however, also puts Syria in a state to be very shapeable. So today we're going to try to describe what's happening, but it's very difficult to anticipate. And it's also dangerous in a way, because if we say this is where we're going to, we sometimes miss so many of the nuances. But we're going to try to talk about some of those details, try to understand where things could go, and what are the main factors that probably we should keep our eyes on and monitor.
What exactly is the state of Syria today?
The state has virtually collapsed on December 8th, and not only on that day. It was throughout the last 14 years, and even before, the weakness of the state and poor governance and corruption, all of those, they were some of the root causes of the Syrian uprising. But on December 8th, the Syrian state really didn't exist in the majority of Syria, and Syrians didn't interact with the Syrian state. On December 11th, I arrived in Damascus, and I saw the city that I grew up in with no government. It was surreal in a way, because no police force, there is no electricity, no services. So the government with its services does not exist, and many of that needs now to be rebuilt up. And that's what makes also the Syrian case very different from other cases in the region, which is the collapse of the state, the disappearance of the state from the parliament to the judiciary branch to the army and different institutions, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because the regime was isolated for so many long time. So we're looking at a state that has been there for a long time, but really many of institutions need to be rebuilt now from scratch.
And now we talk about an issue which, not just for the United States, but for the Gulf Arab states, for Egypt, for the region as a whole, is absolutely critical right now. And it is the identity, the genuine political identity of al-Sharaa, Jawlani, and the governing structure that he has established over the course of these last 4 months. And to boil it down to the critical question, for the last several years, when he was the effective controller of the region of Idlib, he was presenting himself as having broken from al-Qaeda, working to suppress the most violent jihadi groups, al-Sham and others, in Idlib, and establishing his umbrella organization, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as a Islamist but not jihadi force. And that effort at portraying a transformation in intent and policy and identity, Islamist but not jihadi, has accelerated dramatically since his arrival in Damascus. So my question, Rana, to you is, who is the real al-Sharaa?
Thank you. So al-Sharaa has been the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which has itself evolved over the years. In the early years of the Syrian civil war was characterized by many competing rebel groups and groups that had control over different parts of the country. There were certain rebels in control of the south, in the northwest, in the east, in the central Syria. And in the middle period of the war, around 2016, 2017, was when you began to have a consolidation of control, especially by what became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham at that time, over the Idlib region, which was itself shrinking as the regime was making advances since 2015, shrinking rebel territory. In the period from 27 to 2020 is when there was still competition, but also a consolidation of these armed groups. In 2020 thereafter, it became more of a frozen conflict. This is when there were sort of localized ceasefires and agreements to protect the conflict lines as they were. From 2020 to 2024 is when really I think Hayat Tahrir al-Sham leans into governance, this governance role. And they became known as being somewhat technocratic, Islamist, as you say, sort of right-wing conservative, and yet also running their parts of the country quite well. This was aided by certain services that were coming in from Turkey, things like electricity and internet, that were non-existent or very patchy in the rest of the country. In that period of time, there's also large displaced populations in Idlib that are getting international support as well as support from Syrian civil organizations that we can perhaps talk about later. So really the historic moment that Ibrahim referred to was because the conflict was essentially frozen. And in this 11-day rebel offensive that began in late November, they set those conflict lines ablaze. Now they're facing a country that is much larger than the Idlib region that they were once in control of, and much more varied and diverse and they never had control over these parts of the country. And so it's really, when you say, what is the state of the state? Creating that monopoly over the legitimate use of violence, I think, is one of the primary challenges facing these new authorities today.
I think there is a battle between al-Sharaa and al-Jawlani that happens every single day. And that battle will continue because while him as a person, I do think that he transformed and changed because he has clearly strong survival instincts and he catches where the wind is going and he knows which waves to ride. But also he built a coalition of fighters among his group. Some of them, they are loyal to al-Jawlani. They are not loyal to al-Sharaa. So him and the leadership changing is not enough to tell where Syria is going. One of the major questions is, will he be able to transform the rest of the group and move them with him, while he can probably do that more than anyone else because he was al-Jawlani. He has some credibility in that world to move them with him, but also that's a very difficult challenge, and he might at some point see that actually maybe his interest in going back to that persona if the regional and the local and the global dynamics change. But so far, I think that he has an interest to move them, to transform them with him, and he has the credibility, and that's why that opportunity makes or increases his support among Syrians, because they do feel, wide segments of Syrian society feel that al-Sharaa is the only one who can move many of those radicalized fighters closer to the center.
And we've seen over the recent weeks incidences in which the control, the grasp of the government in Damascus has been challenged by former regime elements along the coast and very brutally suppressed, and just today in Druze or predominantly Druze areas of Damascus. The real issue here, and it may be something, your views here are important, that cannot be predicted with certainty, is there is a race against time. Development, aid, basic services for the majority of Syria's population, including the massive internally displaced population, because of the reality of the difficulties of life in Syria. The race is, can that assistance come in time to stabilize his government? And is his government, beyond performative rhetoric, truly committed and able to control all of its elements and make them commit to the establishment of something other than a repressive Islamist regime? Only very small numbers of refugees have returned to date, not because of restrictions either by their country of residence or Syria, but because they are voting with their feet staying home because they see the situation in Syria. Erdogan would profoundly wish to see those 3 million Syrian refugees return. Jordan, the 1.2 or 3 million return, and Lebanon, of course. But that's not going to happen without a place for them to go, jobs for them to hold, and a sense of safety and security in their lives.
I agree with your assessment of the situation. I think it is very difficult for refugees to go home, although we are seeing tens of thousands have begun to do so. I think that there are practical steps that can be encouraged or taken, including neighboring countries like Jordan hosting these large numbers of Syrian refugees, and yet not facilitating go and see visits that would allow them to make this kind of assessment themselves, to see if their areas that they come from are livable. The stakes in a place like Jordan are so high that if you do go into Syria, you cannot come back. You risk losing refugee protection. That's the case for European countries as well. German political parties are currently debating about whether they should allow these sorts of go and see visits. And there's really nothing to lose and only to gain by allowing people that mobility to make informed assessments for themselves. There are parts of the country that are livable and other parts that are not livable. And that's the kind of thing that people want to be able to gain information about.
Although there is a test model out here for the Europeans, for the Jordanians, which is Turkey, which has allowed one come and return visit. And the judgment there has been for even those Syrians not distant in Turkey from where their original homes were in the Syrian northwest, the degree of devastation exceeded even their comprehension of the situation. It is unlikely, I would say, based on the Turkish refugee experience, that more than a tiny fraction of Syrians will make the choice, even living in the straitened circumstances of Lebanon, slightly better in Jordan, much better in Turkey, will choose to go back until they have homes and jobs and a sense of stability. It is not so much restrictive policies by the host governments as the devastated character of Syria. This is a tough one, a very tough one. Both of you know the Gulf states, Egypt, like the U.S. and Europe, have said the mark of whether or not this is a government that can be supported won't be just renunciation of terror. It will be how the government treats women and treats minorities. Minorities don't mean solely Christians. It means, even more importantly, Muslim minorities. The Alawites themselves, other Shia-affiliated minorities, and the Druze. So it's a big test for him and a test for the community at a moment when international assistance is virtually dry. The amount of aid coming in from Turkey, the authorized channel for assistance, in the year that preceded the dramatic historical events of December and late November of last year, were down to a third of the levels of pre-Ukraine 2020 and 2021. They weren't adequate for Idlib and its 3 million population, much less the entire Syrian state. Big, big challenges. So let's talk about the region. What's the regional reaction to those events of November and December? And Ibrahim, I'll start with you.
If we start from the north with Turkey, of course it was great news for Turkey, even though President Erdogan recently, over the last probably couple of years, he tried to reach out for Bashar al-Assad to reach a new understanding, but al-Assad refused. He had some conditions he wanted Turkey to meet. He wasn't realistic. And same if we talk about Arab countries, UAE and Saudi Arabia, they tried to bring Assad back to the Arab fold. They asked him to limit the Captagon, the drugs trade, to allow refugees to go back. He didn't cooperate either. So I think if we look at Turkey, it was a net positive for the Turks. It makes a new opening for them. It allows them also to project more regional influence. However, I would also highlight the government in Damascus is not a Turkish proxy, because also I've seen that in some writings and some comments. The Turkish influence in Syria is limited. They have some influence, but is not that now they have their guy in Damascus. It's way more complicated than that, because where we started when we talked about al-Sharaa and his survival instinct, he realizes that if he over-relies on Turkey, the same way Assad over-relied on Iran, he's gonna fall eventually. He needs to find a way to balance different regional interests so they all are invested in his survival. For Saudi Arabia, the defeat of Iran, if we can say so, in Syria, end of the Captagon trade, also all of that was very positive for them. I think one of the complicating factors is Israel, because Israel doesn't have a clear policy towards Syria. It's mainly shaped by the security lens. And I think while there is an opening for a better agreement, I don't know if we can call it a peace agreement or non-aggression agreement between Damascus and Israel in the future, I don't think it's seen yet from the Israeli side, even though clearly from Damascus side they've been signaling that, including in the speech at the UN by al-Shaybani, the Syrian Minister of Foreign Affairs. So that's it for the region.
And looking at the Gulf states in particular, what are their criteria for extending support, economic support to Syria going to be?
The most cautious one is the United Arab Emirates, because for them, threat number one is political Islam, and that's why they were very hesitant initially. I think they are in a mood, they are more open now. They received some assurances from the government in Damascus that they are not going to export or try to export any ideology or revolutions or political Islam, and they want to focus on investments, they want to focus on reforms, and they want to have a local or inward-looking government. I would say the UAE at this point is wait and see where things will go. For Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they were more optimistic and more enthusiastic about this. They moved very quickly. They tried to support the government. I think what prevents them today is mainly sanctions. I know that domestic issues are very important when you talk about minorities and women and many other parts. I think that honestly is going to be the Syrian battle. That's going to be for Syrians to actually go through that struggle and fight for that. I think at the end, other countries, including the United States, will have mainly national security lens. We've seen that before. I think we're going to see it in the future. I think for domestic issue, it's the Syrian struggle. And I do have hope. I think those Syrians who fought Assad for a long time, not everyone wanted democracy. It was a coalition of different issues. But there is a group that cares about that, and the Syrian civil society will keep that.
Now, Russia actively fought many of the groups that now comprise the government. It was the great supporter. In 2015, it rescued the Assad regime from certain defeat and collapse. Russia seems now to be holding on to its last cards, the two bases in Syria. Giuliani reluctant to antagonize Russia unnecessarily, but a Russia that is no longer a real player on the domestic scene in Syria. Would you agree?
I think that's very nuanced. I think they are not a domestic player. However, they are an important player. They sit on the United Nations Security Council. They do have regional influence, and they can become a spoiler as well. And to where we started when we talked about how they are trying to look inward, I think clearly from Damascus, the signals are we don't want to have trouble with anyone. Not Russia, not Iran, not Israel, not Turkey. We want to have peaceful relationships with everyone to create that sort of balance. And I would add a final point on Russia here. I think the Russians, they found an opportunity to maintain their influence in Syria, because if they leave those bases, most likely the Turks will take over. And Israel doesn't want that. And al-Sharaa is reading that well, that he knows if Turkey becomes so influential in Syria, that will trigger a conflict sooner or later between Israel and Turkey. And that's where Putin comes in now, saying, okay, maybe that's why it's better for Turkey and Israel for me to keep the bases.
Or preemptive Israeli military action, as has occurred at two major bases, which I think the Turks had their eyes on to eliminate their utility in the future. So a careful, no problems with anyone, Russia better in Tartus and its air base than somebody else trying to come in a potential conflict. Let's go back to Turkey and to the north. And here we get to what I would believe is the one issue that does directly involve the United States, which is our now decade-old cooperative arrangement with the so-called SDF, the Kurdish forces that we partnered with in order to effect the final defeat, roundup of ISIS in the Euphrates Valley, and then after that, to maintain the security that confines many thousands of jihadi fighters and still many more thousands of their dependents and families at various facilities in northeast Syria. Turkey, profoundly, as a matter of national priority, wants the relationship between the United States and the SDF, the Kurdish militia, to come to a close. The Pentagon has announced that what we discovered recently to be 2,000 forces, not the 1,000 we thought had been there previously, will be brought down by half. The government in Damascus is negotiating with Mazloum Abdi, the leader of the SDF, over the future of those forces, but on the basis, as it is understood, that they will not be an organic unit. They will be integrated into the overall Syrian forces, and the Northeast will be a part of Syria, not an autonomous entity. So my question will start with you, Ibrahim. Do you see that as doable, as achievable?
I'll build on something Rana initially talked about, the issue of governance. And I know she can speak more to that. And I think that's probably a major point of the disagreements also between the SDF and Damascus. We've seen that they are both interested in solving this issue peacefully, but all the details you talked about, where the SDF or how it will be integrated to the new Syrian army, but also what type of governance there, what type of decentralization, what level of decentralization will be there is crucial. And finally, as you mentioned, this is a two-level game. It's not only Damascus and SDF or Arabs and Kurds, it's also Turkey. So if Turkey is not happy with the equation at the end, it won't last. And that's why it's very challenging for Syrians to achieve that.
The gains of the Kurdish authorities in the northeast over the course of the conflict have really been immense. They have gained territory. They have been able to implement a political vision that is ideological and quite contrasting with the ideology of the new authorities in Damascus, coming more from a left-wing perspective. And they are also assessing the situation of other groups that were operating throughout the country, and to see that some groups are being integrated as organic units, while they are being told that they may not integrate in such a fashion that they should break up and become part of the national institutions. As well, they're seeing the treatment of other groups, including minorities that have maybe surrendered their arms to the new authorities and yet faced new fears after the massacres that took place in the Syrian coast against Alawi civilians, who were blamed by long-running grievances and a lack of trust in Syrian society between these groups that were so divided by the previous regime. It's difficult for me to envision a future that doesn't allow some decentralization to these Kurdish groups, but I have to say there's a lot of opposition to that idea among large swaths of the Syrian population as well as the new authorities. They have a sort of distaste and distrust for mechanisms that risk splitting a country.
And we have seen in a very different part of Syria, the south, with a very different community, the Druze, that efforts to maintain an organic, separate, near autonomy of position based upon military and political cohesiveness hasn't really worked too well over these last 4 months. That even a very tightly knit Druze community has not been able to hold out against at least nominal agreement that the government, Damascus, and its forces should have the monopoly of force. They don't like it, but they've been compelled to accept it. And I would argue for our listeners that the U.S. has a single abiding national security requirement in northeast Syria, which is the maintenance of the controls over the detention and prison facilities, holding extremely dangerous jihadi fighters. If another arrangement can be made that would provide for that effective control, there are very few other reasons for the U.S. to maintain 1,000 or 2,000 forces. And it isn't just Turkey and NATO allies' opposition to that. It's the practical issue of it's a new, different Syria. Is the U.S. going to be sustaining an entity, a military, a political structure which does not accept being part of Syria and whose ability to maintain that posture is entirely dependent on the U.S. military presence? This is a tenuous reed indeed for Kobani, Mazloum, to base the future of his community and his own future upon.
I totally agree with that, and I think for the United States that's a major interest. However, sooner or later also there will be a challenge to have a better relationship with Damascus, because do they also want to make Damascus an enemy for that? And that actually might lead the United States later on to a point where they need to re-increase their presence in Syria. So it's a very delicate equation and a very delicate balance to maintain that, to find a way that those prisons are well managed by trusted partners on the ground, that the Kurds are not abandoned, but also there is an agreement or an understanding with Damascus if there is a continuation of presence inside Syria. And that requires to talk to both the Kurds and Damascus, and it's happening. It also requires to facilitate the dialogue between the Kurds and Damascus, and it's also happening. But also that brings us to the issue of sanctions, because without stabilizing Syria, sooner or later this government will collapse, the same way Assad collapsed. So also allowing Syria to become a natural place again, where people actually can work and find jobs and go to schools and live there, all of that strategically will help in the issue of fighting ISIS and counterterrorism, besides just the military scenario.
Rana?
You referred earlier to this sort of immense material needs and how juxtapositioning that with cutbacks of international aid at this moment, at this juncture. And I agree wholeheartedly with Ibrahim that sanctions are the sort of first issue. It's very hard for people who want to engage, Syrian expatriates, Syrian refugees, who want to bring in remittances. There's so much financial blockage. People can't engage in the banking system of the world because of these U.S. sanctions. So even before anyone's asking for humanitarian assistance, they're asking for some freedom to operate.
Let's just note, there are U.S. sanctions and there are international sanctions, which is why at least not alienating Russia is important, because for all of the sanction regimes, plural, to be lifted, there'll need to be Security Council vote or votes, where Russia, if it wishes, could block any movement or could be a strong supporter of forward movement, Ibrahim, as you referred to, China as well. So I will ask you, given everything we've discussed, and given the need for assistance to provide even a minimum stabilization of the situation in Syria, what should be the approach of the United States, of the international community, to suspending, waiving, lifting sanctions? Is there a test that needs to be applied? Do you lift the sanctions ahead of testing intentions of the government? This is a delicate balance. What comes first? Can you see the intentions, we hope good, play out without stabilization of the economic situation? How far can you go in stabilizing, in providing aid, without being certain of what the character of governance is going to be? What do you both think?
The material needs are immense. The country has de-developed over the course of this war. It has gone from a middle-income country to a very impoverished country. I don't dispute we could use international assistance, right? On the other hand, Syria has been on the receiving end of record-breaking amounts of humanitarian assistance throughout the course of this conflict. And despite those immense quantities of aid, we have had this continued impoverishment of the country because there are more underlying structural problems that need to be resolved. And one of those, of course, is sanctions. There's the lifting sanctions, putting mechanisms to hold the authorities accountable, even while lifting. That is step number one. And we can follow the European countries' lead in doing this. They've already thought through these mechanisms for maintaining some accountability. On the other hand, I think it's important really to think about sort of U.S. leadership and what sort of moral compass that it can provide in this moment when things here at home are not exactly sort of very rights-abiding, right? And so I think that there's a certain skepticism that people have about U.S. moral leadership in this particular moment and the sort of double standards that are at play. I think what international actors can do, be it the U.S. government, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and so forth, is follow the lead of Syrians in this time. People are ready and willing to be part of this immense rebuilding process that it's at hand. Syrian organizations that have been working to uplift the conditions of their communities over the course of this conflict are already moving into Damascus, opening up offices. They want to participate. They want to engage. And I think respectfully following their lead is what international actors can do at this moment, even if lots of humanitarian assistance per se is not going to be forthcoming.
Ibrahim?
I would argue for the case of lifting or at least relieving most of sanctions, not because I think the government is good. It's actually to the contrary of that, because I want Syrians to go back and also challenge that government. 90% of Syrians are below poverty line. Democracies can't be built in such an environment. We need to rebuild the Syrian middle class. And to do that, we need to at least allow others to help or allow Syrians themselves to rebuild the country. So lifting sanctions is one thing, sending aid is another thing. Probably not sending aid, but at least allowing others to do that, allowing Syrians to check their emails. You know, sanctions, you can't even check your Gmail in Syria. I think that's very important for Syrians to be able to challenge. If we do that, it might work, it might not, but if sanctions are there, it's not going to work.
Thank you both very much. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel with support from Maggie Siganova. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.